Welcome back to the Movement Professional Podcast. I'm Dr. Chris Leib. So today I'm going to discuss the idea of exercise technique and how important it is for injury prevention. It's a commonly held belief that if we perfect our exercise technique, we will eliminate or limit substantially our risk of injury. And this podcast will be diving into the research that demonstrates how we might have to question this commonly held belief. So technique does matter, but it's not everything. To define exercise technique, it commonly refers to the specific way an exercise is performed, focuses on proper alignment, movement, and muscle engagement. And usually we're looking to maximize effectiveness of the exercise. And then, again, commonly it's thought of to reduce injury risk. It's a very commonly held belief that perfect technique prevents injury. Surveys done for fitness professionals demonstrated that 76% of them agreed with the statement that perfect form is critical for preventing injury in exercise. 68% of sports coaches indicated that perfecting technique was the most important factor in preventing injuries in their athletes. 84% of gym goers believe that maintaining perfect technique would prevent them from getting injured. And 73% of weightlifters believe that improper technique was the leading cause of injury during lifting, and only 47% of them considered factors like overtraining and fatigue to be equally important, and those are some of the things that we'll discuss. So other contributing factors outside of perfecting technique that are related to pain and injury are things like biomechanical individuality, loading and volume management, fatigue and movement compensation, movement variability, psychological factors and nocebo effects, and recovery between bouts of activity. Biomechanical individuality refers to the differences that we have in our anatomies, things such as difference in limb length, joint structure, muscle insertions. This all affects how each person moves. A study by Maris et al. In 1999 showed that even individuals performing the same movements can experience completely different levels of stress in various body tissues just based on these anatomical differences. So it's really hard to say that perfect technique is one thing for one person and the same for another person because everybody's got a different starting point. So each person has to have a different technique that might be ideal for them. Discussing loading and volume management, something called the acute to chronic workload ratio compares recent training loads to long-term averages, and in research it's demonstrated to be a stronger predictor of injuries than any deviations in form. So Gabbett found this in 2016 that sudden spikes in training load were a primary predictor of injury, even when quote unquote proper technique was used. So a quote from that study is that athletes with good techniques are still susceptible to injury when they experience large increases in load over short periods of time. So increasing your activity too abruptly, not gradually building up your load and your volume, is a greater predictor of injury than anything we can do with technique. In 2009, Davis found something similar and demonstrated that training errors like sudden increases in intensity or volume are more predictive of injury in runners than foot strike mechanics or perfecting running form. His quote was that injury risk is better predicted by training errors than by movement mechanics alone. Similar to load management would be fatigue and then compensations that will come due to this fatigue. So McGregor et al. Concluded that fatigue plays a more significant role in injury risk than deviations in technique. So even with good technique, fatigue can lead to compensations that as we get fatigued, we won't be able to maintain the technique that we thought was perfect as we go, and that becomes a bigger issue than the technique itself. We might be able to teach proper form, but it doesn't matter if the circumstances aren't putting the athlete or the individual in a high level of fatigue. So we have to be able to appreciate how somebody moves at different points of the fatigue process. And there might be different strategies at the beginning of a workout or the beginning of a competition towards the end of the competition. So the methods of training might have to include things like fatigue management or movement efficiency, so we actually might have to change the way we move based on how fatigued we are. This next factor is a really important one, movement variability and just the ability to adapt to varied environments. So a review by Davids et al. Discusses the importance of movement variability in reducing injury risk and highlights that slight deviations in movement patterns or improper technique do not necessarily lead to injury. More specifically, the study suggests that rigid, repetitive movements with minimal variability are actually more likely to contribute to injury than flexible movement strategies that adapt to varying conditions. And I think this is so important when working with people in a gym setting, which is an artificial setting for movement. So to put some type of idea of a perfect form on somebody when it comes to exercise is really a constraint to allowing somebody to find out their own strategies that will be able to adapt to varying conditions. We also have to appreciate that what we do in the gym may not have much carryover to daily life. So we may want to have a little bit of flexibility in how we teach movement and allow people to quote unquote make mistakes so that they can have many options for moving safely. Now, practically, that might mean that we give a buffer zone for exploration in our movement environments, that we're not always pushing to the max, because when we push to a max effort, it may be more important that we have a better biomechanical strategy. However, in daily life, we may have to be moving at different angles that are not afforded to us in the gym. So allowing for a buffer zone of play and exploration can be very useful when it comes to looking at how we train individuals if we're going to look at trying to prevent injury. The quote from the study was, reducing movement variability and striving for one correct technique may actually increase risk by limiting the body's ability to adapt to changes in the environment or task constraints. So one way to look at this is we're trying to build resilience more than we're trying to teach something that is quote unquote correct or perfect. Similar to the concept of movement variability would be movement efficiency. So Smith et al. In 2013 concluded that movement efficiency, which allows for dynamic adaptations, is often more important for injury prevention than adhering to a rigid perfect form. The quote from the study was that attempts to conform all athletes to the same movement pattern may actually increase their susceptibility to injury. So again, I think that's an important concept, that the more we try to drive home a perfect technique, we might actually be doing more harm than good, because individuals won't be able to move well outside of that. And then it also leads to some psychological factors that I'll discuss as we go forward. So psychological factors, things like stress, fear, or overconfidence can actually influence our movement patterns and how our muscles contract and how we protect our body, which can actually increase our injury risk. So Soligard et al. Found that psychological stress increases the likelihood of injury regardless of how we move. So regardless of our technique, if we have increased psychological stress, which again is broad, means many things, but that will actually be a greater predictor of injury than our technique. More specifically is the nocebo effect and pain. So the nocebo effect just refers to the belief that something is harmful. So Coloca et al. Explained in 2012 in their review how the nocebo effect can influence pain perception, particularly in movement-related contexts. So if an individual believes that slight deviations in technique will lead to injury, their brain may heighten their perception of pain or discomfort, even in the absence of tissue damage. And I think this is underestimated by many people, or the old school notion that it's all in my head comes into play here, which current pain science really debunks this idea that there is a separation between pain in the body and pain in the brain, that all pain starts from the brain, the central nervous system, and that we perceive it in our body based on our beliefs of what we feel is dangerous. So that is just the definition of pain. Anytime we receive pain, no matter what, it is coming from our brain. So if we have beliefs that heighten our danger or heighten our fear, then absolutely it will create a sensitivity to more things than we used to perceive. So if we are believing that we're doing something and we lost our technique because we were being told over and over again how important technique is, and if we lose our technique, that's what's going to injure us, it creates a scenario where we are more likely to feel pain doing the exact same things that we would do if we didn't have those nocebic beliefs. So the quote from the study is that nocebo effects in movement arise when individuals are led to believe that certain actions or positions are harmful, creating an expectation of pain that may lead to actual discomfort. I actually see this more commonly than anything I've discussed today in this presentation, and it happens a lot based on language used by other healthcare practitioners. So, as a healthcare practitioner, it's really, really important that we are cognizant of the language that we use with our clients or our patients. Same thing if we're in the strength and conditioning community and we're responsible for the education on trying to get people to move better. There's a fine line between understanding movement efficiency and maybe exploring why somebody might not be moving as efficiently as possible, and then describing that as it's dangerous the way they move. So I think we have to be able to separate out the intention there when we're looking at trying to improve someone's movement capabilities, that when they're not doing things exactly the way we would want them to do, that we're not making them feel fearful that they're going to harm themselves. Because as you're hopefully seeing in this presentation, there's actually not a lot of evidence. So we're speaking out of turn and we're speaking incorrectly and inaccurately when we're saying that, but we're actually doing more harm than good. And I feel like this is a very, very real concern. Finally, we can look at a factor of recovery between bouts of activity. So Clarkson et al. Concluded that time allowed to recover between bouts of activity actually had a greater effect on injury than how we moved or our exercise technique. So the quote from the study was, "The lack of recovery time between sessions is a stronger predictor of injury than minor deviations in exercise technique." So again, goes back to the idea of fatigue and how we may move differently when we're fatigued, but this is slightly different in that we may not be fatigued from exercise in the moment, but we might not have had enough time to recover from strenuous exercise or from movement that we might not be accustomed to. And our body might be going through a process of trying to recover and heal from some of the purposeful damage that we may do to our body to get stronger when we exercise. So we need to keep that in mind when we're doing novel techniques, when we're adding intensity to our workouts, that we can have our technique down pat, but if we just don't have enough recovery between sessions, or we just did something and our body is feeling the effects of the thing that we did, we're more likely to get injured just because we haven't given ourselves enough time to recover. And it has very little to do with actually our technique in that session. Some more research that I think is useful here, and this is specific to the weightlifting community. Researchers Gregory Half and Michael Stone found in 2015 that while proper technique is important for performance efficiency, it is not always the primary factor in injury prevention. And they argue that the relationship between technique and injury is overstated, and factors such as poor programming, inadequate recovery, and load mismanagement play more significant roles. So their quote was, "There is no conclusive evidence that perfecting technical aspects of movement will eliminate injury risks, and in many cases, injury risk arise from chronic overuse or load mismanagement independent of technical faults." So that's my overview of the research. One of the things I can say clinically is that I see this quite a bit, that there's this idea coming in before I get a chance to work with somebody that they have bad technique and that's why they are afraid to actually exercise, and they want to be taught ideal or perfect technique so that they can exercise safely. And the discussion I often have to have gradually over time is that there is no such thing as perfect technique. We can talk about technique for efficiency of movement to allow for better performance, but again, that's very person specific. So we have to look at the individual and see what might be best for their movement, see what they have a hard time doing, and see if we can get them to do certain things better. But it's not necessarily tied to their risk of injury. It could be tied to giving them more options for movement, but may have very little effect on the risk of injury with exercise. So the discussion about how they program their exercise becomes a bigger discussion point than the technique that they're using with exercise. Over time, technique tends to improve from an efficiency standpoint as you challenge yourself more, because you feel the effects of inefficient movement patterns on your performance. Your performance tends to be more limited when you don't make corrections to the mechanics of your movement. That's not a very broad or general thing that we could say for all people, but it's very specific to the individual. So changes in technique tend to happen naturally just with gradually being more consistent with training when you start to realize that there is a value for performance just by changing technique. The nocebo effect of feeling that you are moving incorrectly and that's why you're getting hurt is a very real thing. And I've been a therapist for over 17 years now, and I would say in the last 5 years or so, I feel like I've seen more of the necebic presentations where people are coming in right away and concerned that they don't move well or that they have certain asymmetries or malalignments that are leading to the possibility of injury, but are actually having a hard time describing what their symptoms are. And their biggest concern is their fear of getting injured. So it is its own diagnosis in a way where we have to actually make people more comfortable to move in more varied ways, as opposed to having to think that there's a very specific way that they need to move. And if they don't move that way, they're going to get injured. So there tends to be, in those cases, a lack of curiosity and willing to explore movement, and a feeling that I have to get it right before I get started. I have to make sure that this is right before I add more load, more intensity. And really that often doesn't happen, and you need to actually have the consistency, the gradual exploration of movement over time to really hone your movement technique into what works best for you. So my best advice for injury prevention would be to progress anything gradually, but be consistent. The more consistent you are with movement and with exercise, the more you will learn what works for you and what doesn't. And the idea of injury prevention to me is a little bit of a misnomer, or it is something that is not really possible and not really something that we should be striving for. But what we want to do is mitigate the chronicity of any injury that comes on and the intensity or the severity of any injury that comes on by having a gradual process for how we build up our tolerance to activity. So very commonly, the cause of injury that I see with many people is either a lack of understanding of the loads that they're putting through their body on a regular basis and a lack of variability of movement throughout the course of a lifetime, so that there is a gradual buildup of overuse of the same movement patterns over and over again, regardless of how they're done, and not enough variability. So this could go outside of exercise technique and just go into the idea of like proper posture when one is static. And the idea is that, well, I'm not sitting right, and that's why my back hurts when I sit, as opposed to I might just be sitting too damn long and need to vary as many positions as I can. And then the idea becomes, well, I should just stand more and I should stand with a certain posture. Well, it's like, well, now that's going to start to hurt after a while, because the variability is the key. The ability to adapt to different circumstances is the key, not the proper posture or proper technique. So this is, a battle being fought by many physical therapists every day in the clinics, of just trying to actually backtrack a little from the old school advice that you got to make sure you do everything perfectly or you're going to hurt yourself. All right, so let's be careful with that language. It's one of the most important things, I think, with trying to reduce pain and get people moving a little bit more, is that they don't feel so fearful that they're going to get injured, and just kind of get the process started, get started slowly, get started gradually, be consistent, allow your movement to build up over time, but always be moving forward, looking at what can I do that's a little bit more than I did last week. Having a plan for that becomes more important than I got to make sure my movement is perfect before I get started. So as a summary, injury risk seems to be influenced more by training, load management, fatigue, and recovery than by deviations in exercise technique. Movement variability helps the body adapt to real-world conditions and potentially reduces injury risk. Rigidly enforcing perfect form may overlook the complexity of individual movement patterns and risk factors. The nocebo effect is very real and can occur when excessive emphasis is placed on perfect technique, which leads to fear of movement and heightened pain perception. And encouraging movement confidence and adaptability can be a better strategy for preventing fear avoidance behavior, reducing pain, and improving performance. So hopefully that was useful. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me at movementprofessional.com, or you can send me a direct email to chris@movementprofessional.com. I'll see you next time.